Hi everyone, this is Michael Weatherburn from Imperial College London. This is a seminar entitled Thought Leadership, Hope or Hype, What the Higher Education Sector Needs to Know. And it was presented in real life at Imperial at the Centre for Languages, Culture and Communications. And we thought we'd compress it down with more bite-size and less sort of discussional format because it was a fantastic session, involved lots of discussion. I'm going to introduce some of the feedback and comments gratefully received at that event. And here's the structure, what we're going to talk about today. So firstly, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of thought leadership. You will probably love it or hate it, but and the real life audience demonstrated this perfectly. Almost no one sat on the fence, and that was really interesting. I'd love to know your thoughts too. So I'll introduce you to what does this even mean. Then move you on to a fascinating analytical book called The Ideas Industry by Daniel Dresner from 2017, which summarizes in a really clear way how this differentiates from pre-existing types of public figure. And I think you'll find that really striking. Then moving on to a case study in the present day and looking at some general patterns which have emerged, I think, since 2017, and finally finishing on thoughts for thought leadership in the 2020s. So the live audience were asked to do a poll. And as you can see, they were asked, is the concept of thought leadership an important concept worthy of analysis, or is it not, frankly? And as you can see, there was some skepticism. About a quarter of the audience in person and online thought it was pretty meaningless. And something I would note at this stage is these were typically the ones who have followed up with me several times since, the ones in the red here, with ideas and contacts who'll be interested in this seminar. So it's really striking. Maybe we change some minds as part of the seminar. I hope so. So I asked the audience if they could name a thought leader in their specialism. No, I haven't defined the concept yet. And we got an interesting selection there of novelists, we've got historians, we've got psychologists, and many others. And I think it was really striking when we look at these names later on with certain points in mind. I think something was really striking for the discussion we had in the session itself. And this is something I've got skin in the game on this. These two here are related to me. So Chris Weatherburn, or Christopher, is a GP, as you can see, but also is my brother and runs a YouTube channel where he does reviews of books. And he loves doing it. It's really inspiring to him and therefore, of course, to me. And on the bottom right, there is my cousin, Paul Adamson, who is a full-time essentially motivational speaker for corporations and other organizations. And he did a TED talk back in a few years ago, and you can see it there. Do look for it because it marks the point in his career. He transitioned from being a ship's captain of large yachts owned by other people, I might observe, to this motivational speaker role. And you can see this particular theme coming up in that TED talk there. And speaking of TED talks, I think that probably is when people think of the term thought leader, this seems to be the natural habitat they might think of, as it were. So I put into openart.ai some search terms and to ask me to ask it to generate some images, and I think you'll find them really striking. So immediately I thought of TED Talk. I said, draw me a thought leader giving a TED Talk. And we've got two guys there with very similar clothing giving a TED Talk about something with some gesticulation and so on. I then thought, where else would I imagine a thought leader? So I put in thought leader at the World Economic Forum, the Davos conference, which attracts a great deal of attention and famous world leaders, business leaders, and so on. These people are dressed more formally, as you can see, with a tie pin, and they seem to be, expounding on some large world philosophy that they clearly have in mind. And I thought that was really thought-provoking. Moving on next, we've got thought leader at COP, the United Nations Climate Organization. And then we've gone back to informal. These look like smaller venues. They look like a kind of breakout session, if you've ever been to these kind of large events. And again, they're male and wearing suits of some kind. And I thought that's really thought-provoking. Moving on. Thought leader teaching at a primary school. I thought was a really fun one to do. They binned the jackets and put the ties back on, and you can see the children there are paying a great deal of attention to whatever these gentlemen are saying. And again, we see it's very male, a theme which will continue throughout this seminar and something we discussed at great length in person. Thought leader in McDonald's. I didn't specify the thought leader had to be running the McDonald's, but apparently the AI system did think that. So we have there thought leaders in McDonald's looking very pleased with themselves. And I would observe people often say that imagery created by AI has problem generating hands. And you can see in both cases there it's true. The one on the left has an impossible hand situation, and the one on the right has, I think, three hands if you count where his fingers are. But nonetheless, again, a very striking situation, middle-aged man in a suit, basically, which is a common theme throughout. Also, my favorite, I think, the statue of a thought leader. We have a kind of young, clean-shaven Abraham Lincoln here holding forth to all of history or all of the future. And they've got even more formal, you know, with three-piece suit and so on. But again, it's very striking the kind of people imagined to be thought leaders. And whatever data set OpenArt.ai are drawing from, this is a widely studied problem, including by colleagues at Imperial College, of the data sets, very narrow, on which these AI models are trained, and therefore the outputs are similarly quite narrow. So I think that is a thought-provoking point, but I'll continue on with this agenda aspect later, actually, because the audience found it so interesting. Now, some people in the audience and also who write articles for City AM, which is a London-based newspaper, don't like this term thought leader. And this is quite a recent one. It's a few months old at the time of speaking. And they say it's essentially a kind of somebody would say this when they mean expert, but they're trying to give it a kind of business acumen that it doesn't really deserve. It's a meaningless term. But I think City AM are wrong in this sense, I'm afraid. There is a large amount of not just literature, but institutions growing now, which claim sort of ownership of a thought leadership, be able to provide definitions of quality and so on. And in particular, the one on the top left, the Global Thought Leadership Institute, they run large events, they've got conferences and so on. And I have attended these. They are really good, I would say. People are very, very focused. It's about producing research, but also how do you make it accessible? How do you make it timely? How do you make it attractive for people to use? Do people just want short videos, or do they also want long books and so on? We discussed it at great length, and then how you monitor this, how you develop your data analytics to go with it. And I found it really worthwhile, actually. And I think whether we like it or not, thought leadership is becoming an institutionalized process. And indeed, the APQC, you may know, is a US-based benchmarking organization. So people are even developing definitions of quality in thought leadership and rating them, and people draw on these ratings. I would observe they're quite different from academic channels for those of who are watching who are in the academic sector. And bottom left, Source is a small, medium-sized company in London of about 55, led by Fiona Czernianowska, who has a PhD in history, which is how she and I met in the first place. And they produce these kind of reports of quality of thought leadership. And in fact, companies pay Source to analyze their thought leadership output, usually reports, maybe videos and so on, and to provide feedback and ratings. And then they issue prizes and everything. And you can find, if you just Google this, you can find a whole ecosystem of people and organizations exchanging this kind of material, sometimes for free, sometimes money changes hands. It's mostly in the for-profit sector. And I find that really striking. And I really think this aspect of thought leadership is growing, and in more recent years than the study we're about to look at. I would also please like to differentiate thought leader from concepts such as entrepreneur. There was a vast literature on entrepreneurship, and thought leadership involves entrepreneurship, but an entrepreneur is not necessarily a thought leader. Celebrity. And in fact, one of the audience members who attended the live version of this said, Michael, what you're describing to me is simply celebrities with an entourage, and was not completely convinced until the end. Other concepts that are newer, the influencer, the personal brand, and my favorite, the disruptor. I personally am very interested. I teach courses on technology and organizational analysis. I personally am extremely interested in analyzing these disruptors to find ways of studying how and if they have actually disrupted and what, and whether it's positive or has had less of an impact than they might have hoped, or whether they're just talking about disrupting. But that's a separate talk, separate project for another day. So come with me to this area here. So academics entering, this is given for an academic audience, do remember, in a university. Academic interventions in the public arena have a long history, and some people have critiqued these interventions in the public arena. On the left, this term, which is now sounds very old-fashioned, the telly-don, 1960s and 70s. Some people of any particular age, British-based, will recall Open University videos. This is what three of these are. Often on very early in the morning. If you were quite wealthy, you had a videotape recorder that would, you program it to tape at 5 or 6 in the morning, and then you would watch these educational videos for qualifications. Or you could watch them live, and then your children come in at 7 and want the cartoons on. But they famously, whole blogs and websites dedicated to the clothing and the amazing mannerisms of these often physics professors. These times of day, wearing orange, lots of 1970s orange clothes. In AJP Taylor at the bottom there is a different category. He was very famous in the post-war years. He was an Oxford-based historian whose work I've drawn on myself, and he was very famous for popularizing history as something that appears on television. And some people, such as me, think that's great. Why not embrace a new medium, just as I'm doing now? But some people said this essentially degrades the academic quality of the work, so people shouldn't be doing this. This telly-don was meant as a negative thing. But a very adorable little fact here. In 2020, I got my alumni newsletter from Oxford University that told me that because all the teaching due to the COVID-19 pandemic was online, it said, "We are all telly-dons now," which I thought was an adorable and wonderful insight into how that institution thinks. Much more recently, of course, though, there are critiques about academics and other types of thinkers, researchers, intellectuals appearing in social media and so on. But I like this one on the right here because Bruno Latour, sadly now deceased, but very famous French public intellectual who definitely was a public intellectual, not a thought leader. Some people have said that, his recent passing, it marks the demise of a certain kind of public engagement with knowledge and communication, dissemination, persuasion, and so on. And we instead see a new kind, technologically enabled, replacing the public intellectual. And in this particular case, they focused on Substack, a kind of essay website, a subscription. You essentially establish a small newspaper of your own editing. And this particular author was critical of this shift. But I think to get into the analytical core of today's talk, I'm going to discuss now Daniel Drezner's wonderful book, The Ideas Industry. So I first encountered this when I was supervising a master's by Jacqueline Illy, who was working on the notion of thought leadership in the science communication space, which was the dissertation she was writing. And a colleague called Mike O'Sullivan, who works for Forbes and other institutions, mentioned this book to me, and I passed it on to Jacqueline. We both enjoyed discussing it. But it's not that well known in my experience, particularly in the United Kingdom. So I think it's worth drilling into what it actually says. So Daniel Drezner is a professor of political science in the United States at Tufts University. And this is a wonderful book about how a key shift, he argues, is taking place in the public realm with different kinds of interventions. He projects back into the past and says academics used to have a kind of convincingness, a gravitas that would automatically persuade some audiences. So he says there, which is to say a Harvard professor says something X is bad. Oh, well, he's a professor at Harvard. We should totally listen to him, even if he didn't necessarily know what he was talking about, by the way. So the notion that someone with academic credentials, especially from a very famous global institution like Harvard College, would appear on something talking about anything, and this would be a very persuasive input into debates. And Drezner argues this has changed substantially. What else does he say? So he examined top-level political theorists, economists, newspaper columns, documentary shows with large speaking fees. I mean, these are the elite of thought leaders, if I could put it that way. And this is important to my own analysis, as we'll see. He argues essentially, just like the Bruno Latour point a moment ago, that there were these things called public intellectuals, and they're being replaced or challenged by thought leaders who behave and act differently for good reasons. He says and he doesn't go into this quite so much. This is an old battle which has oscillated across the 20th century with different kinds of public interventions by famous thinkers in different formats, different media, and different types of behaviors. But at the moment, the thought leader is surpassing the public intellectual in this arena. He says, as we'll see in a moment, that thought leaders exhibit strikingly different behaviors from public intellectuals, and I think that's perhaps the most thought-provoking exercise we'll see in today's talk. He also notes, as I mentioned earlier, that thought leaders sometimes partner with for-profit think tanks, which he also observes are a relatively new phenomenon in their own right, singling out, for instance, McKinsey Global Institute. And that is fascinating. I think it was fascinating to the academic audience which listened to this because it essentially means a separate channel of influence, of research, of impact, of influence is emerging that has nothing to do with universities except to train the thought leaders, the researchers, the disseminators in many of their skills, right? The universities are there. Most of these people will have degrees, if not more than one degree. So the university is in there. But essentially, after the people have graduated with their certificates and their skills, they are setting up a separate apparatus altogether from the university research, publishing, funding, remit, the ecosystem, and are achieving, in some cases, I need to develop a measurement of this, but my question, I guess, my research question, is thought leadership per unit essentially having more impact than academic research per unit? And what can we learn from one and the other? And I'm going to talk about that at the end of today's seminar. He goes on, and we're going to look at this as an example in a minute, to argue that thought leaders are essentially now becoming brands in their own right. And Jacqueline Illy, the student I was supervising, was particularly interested in this, studying the fonts and the website design and the logos. All of these people, many of them will have logos, the most famous ones, and agents and things like that might bleed into the notion of a celebrity. And very thought-provoking, Dresner also observed that thought leaders become to describe like cool indie rock bands when they're no longer particularly cool. So people might say, well, so-and-so is a very famous band. They're headlining Burning Man Festival, for instance, or Glastonbury. But I prefer their first album when they were playing in small bars. It's more authentic. They really put their heart and soul into it. It's really gritty often. And if you want to find me on music, you can look on YouTube and find plenty of other videos to watch on that. So I have some experience, and I think there's an element of truth in this. If you look often at these very famous thought leaders who might be in the news or radio podcast guests on all kinds of things, invited by presidents and so on, often their first work that really broke into the public realm was the thing that remains their best known. And I think that's extremely thought-provoking. We're going to come back to that. So according to Dresner, 2017 book, Ideas Industry, what behaviors do thought leaders exhibit? Well, I need to break down some of these concepts here because they may not be immediately familiar to you. So public intellectuals, like Bruno Latour, for instance, mentioned earlier, will be critics of things. They will be foxes. We'll come back to that. Skeptics, deductive, prioritizers expertise, and pessimists. Some of the audience who attended this in real life challenged every single aspect of this, and that's brilliant because, as I always say to students, you can challenge the model, and in fact, if you do so persuasively and convincingly, and especially if you present a better one, you get a very high grade. That's what we're trying to do, is constantly improve the mode of analysis to make it better. And indeed, that's something I've been thinking about a lot myself. Thought leaders, on the other hand, he contrasts, will be creators, hedgehogs, evangelists, inductive, prioritize experience, and optimists. What does this mean? So he draws from an old essay by Isaiah Berlin from 1953. Berlin's a famous Oxford University-based ethicist who used to live quite near where I grew up, in fact. And apparently, drawing from an ancient Greek parable, Berlin describes a fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one big thing. And the second one about deductive versus inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning goes from general to specific. Someone will study lots of data and then find a conclusion from it, whereas inductive goes from the specific to the general. So inductive reasoning often involves theorizing, as academics call it, and then apply it to lots of different phenomena and locations and examples. And do please remember these, make a note right now, because we're going to come back to them and study what the audience mapped themselves onto in relation to this grid. And I think this is extremely thought-provoking. Congratulations to Professor Dresner for coming up with this, because it's not often something impacts me so directly as this, and it really has done so. So I've got a case study here. You may know I'm a historian by background, and so I naturally spot historians appearing in things, especially when they're doing very well. I mentioned AJP Taylor earlier on. And today we're going to look at Yuval Noah Harari. I also surveyed the audience in this in real life. How many of you have studied or familiar with his famous book, Sapiens, in the top right there? And a large majority had. And one even showed me their phone live to show they were listening to the audiobook on the way to the seminar, listening to Sapiens, even though I had not given them a clue I was going to talk about this. And it's sometimes quite hard to get an insight into these thought leaders' actual professional lives. What percentage do they do their sort of day job? He's an academic at the university. What percentage do they do this? How is their kind of business split between these two different roles? And this, I really like this one because Harari's book sold millions of copies. This book, Sapiens, I use it for teaching my own course. It's extremely well written and thought-provoking. And by all means, look up the critiques and analyses of it because it has been controversial in its own right, but it has sold enormous numbers, and that's why I think it's worth mentioning. I always think a cultural phenomenon in which something gets millions of hits or views or sales shows there's something going on that we should be analyzing. Yeah. And even historically, I typically tend to focus on things that got a lot of coverage at the time, even if we don't realize they got a lot of coverage at the time. You can look up my academic publications separately. So this New Yorker, very long New Yorker piece about Harari gives us loads of information about what his thought leadership life is like, in contrast to what we might know about an academic career. So it says he spends almost every appearance denying he is a guru. So you can be a thought leader without saying you're one, right? But when speaking at conferences where CEOs meet public intellectuals or visiting Mark Zuckerberg's Palo Alto house or the Elysee Palace in Paris, he'll put a long finger to his chin and quietly answer questions about Neanderthals, self-driving cars, and the series finale of Game of Thrones, which are, to me, very different subjects. And that is extremely interesting. I would also observe Sapiens tapped into a very popular debate right now about the fundamental nature of humanity, psychologically, sociologically, anthropologically, culturally. What are humans really like beneath all of the complicated layers of history and civilization that are built up in so many different cultures around the world? And that's, I think, why Sapiens was so popular, because people want to get at this question. And many works have come out since Sapiens about 10 years ago exploring aspects of this question. And he also says Harari's publishing and speaking interests now occupy a staff of 12. There were audible gasps in the real life audience for this one, because who doesn't want a staff of 12? We work out of a sunny office in Tel Aviv, where an employee from Peru cooks everyone vegan lunches. And it outlines his working day. Apparently, Harari has a 1 hour swim in a swimming pool with a snorkel on, listening to audiobooks of many topics, like the 3 topics mentioned here. And he listens to those, and then he goes to his home where an assistant has printed out physical news stories that he should read that are relevant to his interests. And this is how he manages apparently to sift so many topics and so many debating points and talking points from across the world. Whenever you can find many videos of Harari addressing all manner of topics that are little to do with history. Yet some people find them extremely convincing, and allegedly he has paid huge sums of money. And indeed, one of the audience attendees in real life said they tried to, at a previous job, they tried to get Harari as a speaker, and he charged such a large sum of money for a 1 hour seminar. They were unable, unfortunately, to arrange that meeting. So it was nice to see. Someone also mentioned to me, by the way, in the media context, that sometimes the agents put very inflated fees online that are there to seem aspirational, so then your audience can claim they're getting a kind of mates rates if they're being charged less than that. But in this case, the fee was in fact what is publicly available, and it was really useful to be able to correlate that information. Some more recent ones. These are all historians, and this is why I particularly mention this. I would love to expand this kind of analysis to other specialisms. So Harari, there he is again on the left. There is this tendency now to produce this kind of numbered lessons. And there's often a chapter or 7 chapters or 20 chapters or 8 chapters or whatever in these books. So Harari, 21 Lessons of the 21st Century, that's very kind of bite-sized book. It's often each chapter is orientated towards a particular sector. So, for example, colleague of mine mentioned the education chapter. He said you should read Harari's education chapter. I said, it's really interesting? Is it? Not really, he said. But the reason why you should read it is it's been extremely influential to these kind of global bodies. And then it's trickled down through the apparatus of the state to you, Michael, which is why you keep talking about certain words in your job on an hourly basis. And so does my colleague who is from Singapore. And we have exactly the same shared language and kind of strategic aspirations. And lo and behold, it's been satisfying to trace it back to where this has come from. And that is worthy as a phenomenon, I think, worth understanding in relation to many topics. Where do ideas come from and how do they disseminate? Tim Snyder in the middle is a historian of Ukraine who is understandably very much in demand. He carries a great gravitas. His previous work, Bloodlands, was a textbook for a European history seminar series I used to run. And he has produced this more recent work on generally drawing on lessons as how does political authority develop, in this case, become tyranny, drawing on lessons from the 1930s Europe, for instance. And then on the right, Gordon Brown, of course, is famous as a politician, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He's also a historian. Not many people, many people know he has a PhD, but very few people know it's a PhD in the history of political ideas. They think he's often an economist. And he, some years ago, produced, again, this kind of historically informed lessons as to what people should perhaps be doing to address the world's problems. So my discussion points that I would love your challenges on, your ideas and your responses. My argument, drawing on Dresner, which is a 7-year-old book at the time of recording, thought leaders continue to be influential, and in fact might be increasingly so, and I would argue are increasingly so, and they're institutionalizing. And I think it's naive to deny these organizations exist and have influence, and I want to understand that influence, and that's part of this project. Sometimes public intellectuals are sometimes slow to take advantage of new tools. I'll talk about in a moment. The thought leadership institutions I mentioned earlier on in this seminar are not slow. They're very fast adopters of new technology, and they're very precise and analytical about using it. And we'll come back to that in a minute. As I also mentioned, some people are developing new career opportunities essentially out of spinning an academic career into the thought leadership space rather than the public intellectual space. Some people, I could mention if we had more time, have developed an entire thought leadership profile and now resigned their academic jobs. All they do is thought leadership, but the hope in, I believe, these people are doing, often whom are on the younger end of the spectrum, are that they carry the gravitas of the former academic employment, research, teaching profile. And something that we generated much discussion in the real life seminar of this was the notion of the decline of trust, or even, unfortunately, belief in parliamentarianism. If one is looking for inspirational leadership, do we get it through parliaments? Do we get it through the private sector, through NGOs, through political organizations, through trade unions, and through the many types of institutions that have historically produced leaders? And this produced a great deal of discussion because some of the audience are familiar with political attitudes of publics, for instance, that apparently say there is a very low trust in parliamentarianism. That is change through parliament, legal change through voting and so on, and that people are engaging in different kinds of change, shall we say. Yeah. And there are many historical precedents of people trying to achieve different types of change, not through parliament for whatever reason. The person of Greta Thunberg came up, who was at the time she became a global figure, was a teenage girl in a Swedish school, which does not fulfill many of patterns of the kind of leadership that might be historically or politically analyzed. And I think it is very interesting to consider this as a kind of people are looking for inspiration. They don't know where to find it. Thought leadership is in some ways sort of filling the criteria, and it gets a lot of traction in certain instances. But also going down to the more kind of individual level, including myself, because I've thought about this a great deal. I think that many types of knowledge workers, not just academics, you'll get all kinds of white collar knowledge workers, lawyers, accountants, management consultancies, spinning out loads of videos and documents and policy briefings and all these kinds of things. I think people have picked up on the phenomenon that we've been looking at unconsciously, in fact, almost exclusively unconsciously. They don't realize why they're doing it, but they feel the need to emulate this behavior that they see around them. They see it as a kind of impact, a format of impact or influence. Perhaps we should do this. And you might find some guidance on how to make YouTube videos or something. And people are following this sort of micro advice, but without any end goal in mind. There's no strategic plan in a way that someone might sit down and say, I'm going to produce publications. I want to have a certain amount of business development or strategic growth in the next 10 years. Often this sort of miniature thought leadership, which I mentioned below, has got no such clarity of planning or strategy. It's just something you do when you've got some spare time and you're trying to make some connections you don't fully understand and can't explicate. So my argument also in the next slide is that newer aspects of social media have allowed us to develop into miniature thought leaders. So what do I mean by that? There's been many technological developments even since 2017 to date. The social media in question that Dresner was drawing on was Facebook and Twitter, which, okay, they were the cutting edge in the 2010s. I think now we have new vehicles that are even better refined for this purpose. And we find there's huge amounts of output through this, through perhaps social media, types of text or video hosting sites. YouTube, huge quantity of material going through this. Globally speaking, I'm sure there's 50 times as much video produced publicly than there used to be even 5 or 10 years ago. Nationally, in a well-developed country like the United Kingdom, I would guess it's probably maybe 5 times as much. Just think about your own activity. How much more video do you record than you used to in 2017, especially for public consumption? It could be in training, teaching, corporate communications, something like this. And there are many, many more platforms I could mention. There are also the emergence or the strengthening and expansion of certain platforms. X, used to formerly Twitter, is taking on kind of new dimensions. It's undergoing some changes. TikTok, Instagram have taken off enormously since then. They're very visual, short videos and pictures. And again, think about how much, not so much for family and friends, how much professionally more stuff you do in this space. LinkedIn, I do as well. That's in fact my key focus of this kind of area. And I didn't kind of know why I was doing it. And thinking about this has really helped me clarify. There's also the issue, there's so much content now. There's the emergence of wonderful books about this as a problem in its own right. Both the books on the left were recommended to me by colleagues at Imperial College in London, and I loved both of them all the way through. Julia Bell is a UK-based academic. She's a literature specialist, drawing on the writings of Simone Weil, in particular, the French philosopher, on attention. Subsequent works have been also drawing on this, like Johann Hari's Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention. And they both get into very deep phenomenological aspects of media and communication and time management, and talk about how not just we can't pay attention, I think that's a well-known problem, the so-called attention economy or attention deficit, but also various solutions to this problem, how we can overcome this as an issue and develop deeper, better thought. The crucial thing both of these works say is we're essentially developing lower quality thoughts because we don't pay attention and we produce tiny little snack-sized videos that are 6 seconds long, and that we could produce better, more consequential, more influential work if we have more time to concentrate. And I think we'll all associate with that idea. Now, to finish, the audience in question were asked to rank themselves according to Dresner's definitions and rate themselves on this poll. There was a lot of consternation about what if I'm deductive and inductive depending on the day, which I associate with, but and depending on the problem. But I just was like, just instant reaction. What do you think? And what was really striking is how spread the result is, how much towards a thought leader relative to a public intellectual the audience was geared, but that could be who was attracted to the event. And we even had some people surprising themselves by getting, for example, -6 or +6, which is the standard thing when you do some kind of personality test, right? No one thinks it's literally true, but it can be thought-provoking and it can help you to identify behaviors or preferences within yourself that you may not have thought about before. And the +6 person on here, I won't embarrass them by mentioning their name, had it never occurred to them that they would have been drawing on these particular behaviors so strongly. And I suspect it has really helped to transform the types of opportunities they're looking for. And that in particular person is a specialist in art. And of course, as I mentioned, visual outputs are really, really, really striking right now. So it could help them build up an aspect of their profile they might not have been thinking about before. And I really hope this talk today has also helped you do so. So, some key takeaways from this. All of this takes time. There's such a thing as opportunity cost. We all feel this. You can only focus on a certain amount of projects, and you must sort of think which is the highest value to me. And I give a previous seminar on this to do with consultancy work. And also, there's no shortcuts as it stands to this. Maybe this talk will become one. There's very little overview training. Okay, I want a thought leadership kind of package portfolio. What do I have to do? You can find all the little bits, how to make videos, how to post them at particular times of day, and so on. But you can't find just, I want a thought leadership profile. How do I do it? And if you want to get in touch and talk about it, please do. I would argue this thing about losing quality or credence or credibility of your work over the thought leadership journey, to coin a phrase. People like the early work. They take the less the subsequent work. It may be expensive, but it may also not be so credible in some people's eyes. I would say you've got to develop your core work. Don't give up the day job, like they say. This is an addition to an interesting career CV profile portfolio, whatever you want to call it. But it is worth thinking about. Social media can be great, and I think point number three, social media can be great, and I think it is necessary, but don't overdo it because it can impact your core work. Some people are really, really good at operating particular social media platforms. You'll know some political thinkers who can use Twitter, now X, extremely well to reach enormous audiences and to influence their political views. Other things, TikTok, Instagram, influencers, these people have full-time jobs being influencing people as a kind of marketing career. I would say I'm not good enough at that stuff to compete with these people, so I don't try. I operate in areas that I'm comfortable with, that my audience is in, that is also not trying to do this, but they do want and people want an aspect of this kind of public intervention, research-based, evidence-based, hopefully got a lot of gravitas, but don't overdo it because it can impact your core work. Something that I'm going to monitor, just to make this a bit meta, I argued that often institutions and people that produce videos, documents, and so on, great, but don't strategize when they use it subsequently. The assumption is still the real life event is the core activity, and the subsequent thing, put it up on a Sunday when you remember it 3 months later. Institutions with which I'm affiliated that are very august, influential, and excellent institutions often follow this format of not trying to follow up quickly and effectively and to try to get traction with the outputs. So I'm even going to monitor the number of views of this video relative to how many people came in real life, how many emails I get, just to see if I'm right, because I think usually I am. We all look at this kind of thing. I got a lot of feedback from the original version of this seminar, so I look forward to getting even more subsequently. And then something that's more broad, that's something that's broader and outside my remit right now, but still is worth mentioning. If this is time consuming and hopefully adds value to the employer's portfolio, because public facing, you get a lot of traction, perhaps academic hiring and promotions could take these points on. There is usually a little bit on knowledge exchange or impact or public profile, but subjected to nothing like the statistical scrutiny of citations. For instance, bibliometrics are like a science in their own right. That's the science of counting citations as a measure of impact. There is, as I say, there's just not the maturity of analysis included in this in academic careers, and it would be great if we could develop that if this is going to be something that we value and carry forward into the future. And on that note, do get in touch. This has been Thought Leadership, Hope or Hype, what the higher education sector needs to know. Thanks for listening. See you around.